Eli Jensen loved the quiet. After 30 years designing buildings for other people, he finally built one for himself. A modest off-grid cabin just past the tree line, where the mountains met a sleepy lakeside neighborhood. The land was legally his, purchased years ago before development crept in from the nearby streets. He made sure it sat outside the boundaries of the neighborhoods association, but close enough to enjoy the peace and trails nearby. The cabin was simple but thoughtful, hand-finished cedar siding. Solar panels tucked along the roofline and a stone path that led from the dirt road to his front steps. Eli spent his weekends there reading, writing, watching the sunrise from a weathered chair on the porch. It was supposed to be a retreat. Then, one Monday morning, he came back from the local market to find a folded envelope taped neatly to his cabin door. Printed in bold across the top was the name of the neighborhood's association board. Below it, a short letter, polite in wording, but firm in tone. According to the note, his cabin was unrecognized under the board's current building guidelines. It stated that he had 72 hours to remove the unauthorized structure, or further steps would be taken. Eli read the letter twice on the porch, then again seated at his table inside. The words didn't make sense. He had carefully planned every part of the build. His permits were signed by the county. The land was privately owned and zoned for light residential use. There were no shared utilities running through it. No easements, no common spaces nearby. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the window. There was no one around. Just the rustle of tall grass and a few birds darting between branches. The quiet, which normally soothed him, now felt still in a different way. Eli pulled out his folder of land records, deeds, survey maps, utility documents. Everything confirmed. What he already knew, his land was outside the governing reach of the association. In fact, it bordered a parcel of land still owned by a property trustee had invested in years earlier. That detail caught his attention. He remembered buying into the trust as part of a group supporting low-impact land use. The trust owned a few scattered parcels, nothing large but enough to matter. Quick online search confirmed what he suspected. The neighborhood's clubhouse parking lot, small storage shed, and one of the maintenance paths all sat on land leased from that. Same trust. Eli quietly smiled. He hadn't thought about that investment in years. Digging deeper, he found an email address for the trust's managing partner. It had changed hands over the years, but he still held a majority share. As a shareholder with controlling interest, he could request a lease review at any time. He didn't feel angry. He felt clear. That evening, as the sun set over the cabin roof, Eli wrote a short message to the trust's manager. I'd like to review the terms of the current lease with the neighborhood board. There may be some updates worth considering. Please advise on next steps. Signed it simply, no drama, no big explanation. Eli believed in structure, in good planning, and most of all, in respectful conversations. But when someone placed a letter on his door without ever knocking, and asked him to erase something he had built with care, he knew it was time to respond. Not with noise, not with resistance, just with quiet steps in the right direction. The next morning, Eli awoke early as usual. The cabin was still bathed in soft dawn light, and the scent of pine mingled with the crisp mountain air. Before heading out to the trails, he opened his laptop again to review everything he could find about the neighborhood and the property trust he controlled at first glance. The association's governing documents seemed straightforward rules about landscaping, architectural standards, and shared facilities. But buried within the pages was a subtle clause about leased land. It specified that the association leased several parcels from the trust, including the clubhouse parking, a small maintenance shed, and the hiking trail easement. The lease was set to expire in just under 2 weeks. Eli sat back and let the information settle. The lease was a private contract, not a public rule. Yet it gave him considerable leverage. He had a chance not just to respond to the notice on his door, but to influence how the association operated on leased properties. And perhaps more importantly, how they engaged with residents. Curious. About the association's current leadership, Eli pulled up recent board meeting minutes posted on their website. The tone was mostly formal decisions about landscaping, upcoming events, and budget approvals. But here and there, he noticed brief mentions of enforcement actions related to residents' property details. Not much explanation, no context about who was involved or why. It was clear that the board took enforcement seriously, perhaps too seriously, without considering individual circumstances. He decided to visit a few neighbors, just outside the trust's property line. People he knew had lived in the area for years. Maybe they could shed light on the association's relationship with homeowners. First was Mrs. Lopez, who lived a few lots down from the cabin. She had a small garden filled with native flowers and a patch of vegetables. Eli stopped by with a basket of fresh apples from town. "Morning, Mrs. Lopez," he said. "I hope I'm not bothering you." She smiled warmly. "Not at all, Eli. What brings you this early?" Explained the letter on his door, carefully leaving out the parts. "That might sound confrontational." Mrs. Lopez nodded thoughtfully. "The association has been more strict lately. Just last month, they asked me to change the style of my mailbox. Said it didn't match the neighborhood." Eli raised his eyebrows. "Did you have to?" She shrugged. "I put a fresh coat of paint on it, didn't want to make waves. But it's hard, you know. Sometimes it feels like they forget we're people with homes, not just boxes on a map." Next, Eli stopped by Paul's house, a retired teacher with a reputation for speaking his mind. Paul was tending his lawn and waved Eli over. "I hear the HOA sent you a letter," Paul said without preamble. Eli nodded. "Yes, about the cabin." Paul wiped his hands on his jeans. "They've been on edge about a lot lately. We all have. But not many of us talk about it. It's too many headaches." "Do you think they listen to residents?" Eli asked. Paul laughed, a low, tired sound. "Not enough. Most decisions happen behind closed doors, and by the time they tell us, it's already set." The conversations left Eli with a growing sense that the association's process lacked openness. But they also reminded him that the neighbors wanted something better, a chance to be heard without feeling pushed around. Back at the cabin, Eli reviewed the lease terms again and began drafting a letter to the trust's management. He planned to propose a review of the lease conditions, including how enforcement actions were communicated and handled. His goal wasn't to escalate conflict, but to open a dialogue, one built on respect and fairness. As the sun set behind the mountains, Eli sat on his porch, sipping tea, feeling that this was just the beginning. The letter on his door had been the spark. Now it was time to start a conversation. Eli spent the next morning carefully reviewing the documents related to the trust and the neighborhood association's lease agreement. The finer details of contracts and lease terms, often overlooked by many, now became his focus. He wasn't interested in confrontation, only in understanding the facts and finding a fair path forward. He dialed the number for the trust's property manager, a woman named Claire whom he hadn't spoken with in years. After a few rings, she answered with a warm but business-like tone. "Eli Jensen, how can I help you today?" Claire asked. "Hi Claire, it's been a while. I'm reaching out about the lease agreement between the trust and the neighborhood association. I recently received a notice about my cabin and wanted to discuss the lease terms, especially since the current contract is expiring soon." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Claire responded, "Of course. The lease is due for renewal in less than 2 weeks. We've been preparing for the meeting with the association board. Is there something specific you'd like to address?" "Yes," Eli said. "Given the situation with my cabin, I think it's important that we revisit some of the terms, not just for the cabin, but for the common areas the association uses. There are opportunities to improve communication and ensure that residents feel respected in the process." Claire was silent for a moment. "That's an interesting point. We've been focused mostly on the lease fees and maintenance costs, but I agree that the residents' experience matters. What do you suggest?" Eli explained that the lease should reflect not only financial arrangements, but also include clear expectations about how the association interacts with landowners, especially those who own adjacent or leased parcels. We could include provisions for regular resident input, transparent communication regarding property use, and perhaps some protections to avoid sudden notices like the one I received. Eli proposed. Claire appreciated the thoughtful approach. I'll bring this up at the upcoming board meeting. Since you hold majority shares in the trust, your perspective carries weight. After the call, Eli felt a flicker of optimism. His quiet investment years ago wasn't just a financial asset. It was a tool to build better relationships. Later, that day, Eli decided to write a letter to the Neighborhood Association's board president, Mr. Stevens. He wanted to open a respectful dialogue before any further steps were taken. Dear Mr. Stevens, I recently received a notice regarding my cabin. While I respect the association's role in maintaining neighborhood standards, I believe there has been some confusion about property boundaries and governance. As the majority shareholder in the property, trust leasing key areas to the association. I would like to propose a discussion regarding lease terms and communication processes. My hope is that together, we can find solutions that benefit all residents and honor property rights with mutual respect. I look forward to hearing from you. Eli sent the letter with a calm sense of purpose. That evening, he took a walk along the nearby trails, enjoying the fading light and the cool breeze rustling the pines. He reflected on the chain of events: a letter, a call, a conversation, the neighborhood. He realized wasn't just about rules or contracts. It was about people, shared spaces, and the balance between individual freedom and collective care. Eli wasn't planning to fight. He was planning to build bridges, understanding, and perhaps a little change. Eli knew that understanding the bigger picture meant hearing more voices. After all, the neighborhood was made up of individuals, each with their own stories and concerns. The letter on his door was one thing, but what about the others? Over the next few days, Eli set out to visit some of the longtime residents he trusted. He didn't want to stir up tension or gossip. Instead, he hoped to learn how others felt about the association's approach to managing the wall neighborhood and its policies. His first stop was at the home of Linda and Greg Harper, a retired couple, who had lived there for over 15 years. Their yard was lush with blooming shrubs and carefully maintained walkways. Good afternoon. Linda, Greg, Eli greeted them warmly. Linda smiled. Eli, what a nice surprise. Come in. Over coffee on their patio, Eli shared a little about the notice he'd received, but kept the focus broad. Have you ever felt the board has been too strict or maybe a little distant from the homeowners? He asked gently. Greg took a thoughtful sip. There have been moments, sure. Last year, they asked me to remove some outdoor lights because they said it wasn't in keeping with neighborhood standards. I hadn't even noticed anything unusual, but they sent a formal letter. Linda nodded. It felt a bit heavy-handed. We like to keep things natural, but they seem to want a very specific look. It can be discouraging. Eli listened carefully. Do you think the board listens to residents when concerns arise? Greg shrugged. Not really. Most decisions seem made before we hear about them. We get the results, but not the discussions. Next, Eli stopped by a few other homes, including that of Marissa, a young mother who had recently moved into the neighborhood. She shared how her kids loved the hiking trails, but mentioned that the board had recently installed new signs, limiting certain activities without much explanation. It feels like rules come down suddenly, Marissa said. We want to respect the neighborhood, but it would be nice to have more clarity or even a chance to weigh in. These conversations painted a picture Eli hadn't fully realized. The board's approach, while well-intentioned, seemed to create a sense of distance and frustration. People wanted to feel part of decisions, not simply subject to them. Eli thought about his own experience. How a simple letter had arrived without a word of introduction or dialogue. Later that day, he walked the trails near his cabin. The sun was lowering, casting golden light through the pines. He felt the quiet strength of the land beneath his feet. If he was going to move forward, it wouldn't be by confrontation. It would be by building trust and opening the door to better conversations. Eli decided to invite a few neighbors for an informal gathering at his cabin. Nothing official, just a chance to talk about what they cared about, their homes, them, land, and how to live well together. He sent simple handwritten notes, inviting those he'd met and a few others who had voiced concerns before. The day of the gathering, small group showed up, families, retirees, and longtime residents. They shared stories over coffee and pastries, laughed at old memories, and spoke candidly about what they wanted the neighborhood to feel like. Eli listened more than he spoke, but when he did, he shared his perspective, the lease, the letter, and his hope that the association could find a better way forward with input from all residents by the end of the afternoon. There was a quiet consensus. People wanted a transparent, respectful approach. They wanted their voices heard and their homes valued. As guests left, one neighbor stayed behind to shake Eli's hand. "You're exactly what we need," she said softly. Eli smiled. "Let's see where this goes." That night, back on his porch, Eli watched the stars blink into view. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in days, he felt ready. The letter on his door had sparked more than a dispute. It had sparked a conversation. Days passed after the gathering at Eli's cabin. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, but also knew that meaningful change rarely came quickly. The neighborhood board remained the key player, and he was still waiting for a response from their president, Mr. Stevens, to the letter he had sent. Then one afternoon, an email popped into his inbox. The subject line read simply, Lease terms and communication. Eli opened it carefully. Mr. Stevens began with polite greetings, acknowledging the letter and the importance of the points raised. The tone was formal but less distant than the letters Eli had received before. The board was open to scheduling a meeting to discuss the lease terms with the trust, and more broadly, how the association engaged with residents. Mr. Stevens wrote that the board recognized the need for better communication and transparency, especially with upcoming lease renewals and neighborhood developments. Eli felt a flicker of hope. He replied promptly, proposing a few dates and requesting that some of the residents who had attended his gathering be invited. If the association was serious about building trust, it made sense to include voices from the neighborhood. A week later, the meeting was set. Eli prepared carefully. He gathered all the documents, notes from neighbor conversations, and a clear outline of his ideas for improving lease terms and communication. On the day of the meeting, he arrived early at the neighborhood clubhouse. The room was bright and arranged with folding chairs around a large conference table. Mr. Stevens greeted him with a firm handshake, followed by the rest of the board members. A handful of residents, including Linda, Greg, and Marissa, joined the meeting as well. The atmosphere was polite but cautious. Eli started by explaining his background, his investment in the property trust, his love for the cabin, and the unexpected notice that had brought him here. He then laid out his suggestions: regular updates to residents about lease agreements and neighborhood decisions, opportunities for residents to provide feedback before decisions were finalized, clear guidelines on how notices and communications should be delivered, a joint committee to oversee lease and property issues, including resident representatives. As he spoke, Eli noticed nods around the table. The board members seemed engaged, and the residents appreciated the chance to be heard directly. Mr. Stevens responded thoughtfully, "These are constructive points, Eli. We've been so focused on enforcement and maintenance that we may have overlooked the importance of engagement. I believe there's room for collaboration." The discussion flowed naturally. Concerns were voiced on both sides about financial responsibilities, property rights, and preserving the neighborhood's character. But for the first time, the conversation wasn't about ultimatums or deadlines. It was about solutions by the end of the meeting. Everyone agreed on a plan. The lease terms would be reviewed with input from both the trust and the association. A monthly newsletter would be launched to keep residents informed. A resident advisory panel would be formed to provide ongoing feedback. Eli left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. Change would take time, but the door was open as he walked back to his cabin. The wind rustled the pines and the evening sky glowed with soft pinks and oranges. The letter on his door had been a challenge, but it had also been an opportunity. Eli realized that sometimes standing firm with patience and clarity could turn conflict into collaboration, and in the quiet spaces between trees and neighbors, real progress could begin. Following the promising meeting with the neighborhood board, Eli felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path ahead was clear, but would require patience and steady effort. Change in any established system rarely happens overnight, especially when it involves balancing diverse interests. True to their word, the board began rolling out the agreed-upon changes in the weeks that followed. The monthly newsletter arrived in residents' mailboxes and inboxes, offering updates on lease agreements, upcoming meetings, and neighborhood projects. More importantly, it included a section dedicated to residents' questions and feedback. Eli made sure to contribute regularly, sharing insights about the property trust and inviting neighbors to voice their thoughts. His tone was calm and inclusive, emphasizing collaboration rather than conflict. Meanwhile, resident advisory panel began taking shape. Volunteers from across the neighborhood signed up, including familiar faces like Linda, Greg, and Marissa, along with a few new participants. The group met monthly to discuss concerns and propose recommendations to the board. At the first advisory meeting, Eli spoke about the importance of transparency and mutual respect. He encouraged open dialogue and suggested the panel serve as a bridge between residents and the board. The panel members shared a variety of perspectives, from concerns about landscaping standards to questions about parking and event scheduling. Eli listened carefully, taking notes and promising to raise these topics in future board meetings outside of formal meetings. Eli also made an effort to engage informally with neighbors. He hosted occasional get-togethers at his cabin, creating a space for casual conversation and connection. These gatherings grew into a welcomed tradition, helping build a sense of community beyond paperwork and rules. One afternoon, as Eli was pruning a small cedar sapling near his porch, Marissa stopped by with her 2 children. "We wanted to thank you," she said softly. "The neighborhood feels different now, more open, more friendly. You helped start that." Eli smiled. "Everyone's effort, Marissa. I'm just glad to be part of it." At the same time, Eli kept a close eye on the lease renewal process. He worked with Claire, the trust's property manager, to prepare updated terms that reflected the neighborhood's needs and the new collaborative spirit. They included provisions for scheduled reviews, clearer communication protocols, and shared responsibility for common area maintenance. When the trust board met to approve the revised lease, Eli presented the plan with quiet confidence. The trustees appreciated the thoroughness and the emphasis on cooperation. Soon after, the neighborhood association ratified the new lease agreement at their monthly meeting. With applause and expressions of support from both board members and residents, Eli's cabin was no longer a point of contention, but a symbol of progress, proof that respectful dialogue and shared goals could overcome misunderstandings. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, Eli stood on his porch, looking out at the familiar landscape. The air was cool, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. He reflected on the journey from that first surprising notice to the present moment. What had started as a challenge had become an opportunity to strengthen ties not just between himself and the board, but among all neighbors. Eli realized that managing property wasn't just about leases or letters. It was about people, trust, and the willingness to listen. And that, more than anything, made a house a home. Just as Eli began to feel the neighborhood's rhythm settling into a healthier, more open pace, a new challenge emerged, one that tested the community's growing trust and resilience. A few weeks after the new lease terms were approved, several residents approached Eli with concerns about a proposed commercial development nearby. The plan was to build a small retail center just outside the neighborhood's boundaries, close enough to potentially impact traffic, noise levels, and the natural scenery everyone cherished. The news quickly spread, stirring conversations and uncertainty among neighbors. Some feared the development might erode the peaceful atmosphere they valued, while others saw economic opportunities and increased convenience. Eli listened carefully to the mixed opinions. The situation was complex, balancing progress with preservation, growth with quietude. Drawing on his experience and his role as a property trust shareholder, Eli called for an open neighborhood forum to discuss the development proposal. He reached out to the neighborhood board and the advisory panel, inviting local officials and the development company's representatives to join the conversation. The forum was held in the clubhouse. The room buzzed with energy. Residents filled the seats, some with notes and questions prepared, others simply eager to hear and be heard. Eli began by outlining the facts, what was known about the project, the timeline, and potential impacts. Then he opened the floor to discussion. Voices rose concerns about increased traffic safety, environmental effects on nearby trails, and how the retail center might alter the neighborhood's character. At the same time, some residents pointed out potential benefits like local jobs and amenities within walking distance. Representatives from the development company listened intently and offered to consider resident feedback in their planning. Local officials promised to monitor permits closely and enforce standards that protect the area's integrity. By the end of the forum, a consensus emerged around creating a community oversight group, a collaboration between residents, the board, the trust, and developers. Their mission, to ensure the project balanced growth with the neighborhood's values. Eli felt a swell of pride. The community had faced uncertainty with openness and respect, turning a potentially divisive issue into a chance for collaboration. In the days following, the oversight group formed quickly. Eli volunteered to chair the panel, viewing it as another step toward sustained partnership and shared stewardship. The process was far from easy. Meetings sometimes grew tense as competing priorities surfaced, but the group kept returning to a core principle: listening, understanding, and finding creative solutions. Traffic flow was adjusted through added signage and designated parking areas. Landscaping plans included natural buffers to shield homes from noise and visual impact. And developers agreed to support neighborhood events and local environmental initiatives. Meanwhile, Eli continued his role as a neighbor and liaison, ensuring that conversations remained transparent and inclusive. His efforts helped remind everyone that progress and preservation were not mutually exclusive, they could coexist. When guided by thoughtful dialogue and mutual respect, one evening as Eli sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in warm hues, Marissa stopped by with her children. "Thank you for everything you're doing," she said. "This neighborhood feels stronger because of you." Eli smiled, feeling the truth in her words. The letter on his door had once threatened to append his quiet retreat. Instead, it had sparked a journey, one of understanding, community, and unexpected growth. And that journey was far from over. Months passed since the community oversight group had been formed, and the neighborhood felt different, more connected, more aware, more alive. The retail development project was underway, but with careful attention to the values that made the area special. Traffic improvements, landscaping buffers, and environmental safeguards had helped ease many concerns. For Eli, this period marked a turning point. What had started as a sudden, unsettling notice about his cabin had transformed into a journey of partnership, listening, and change. He found himself more invested than ever, not just financially, but personally. Its role in the trust, the advisory panel, and the oversight group allowed him to help shape the neighborhood's future while honoring its past. One crisp autumn evening, Eli sat on his porch watching the fading light. The pines whispered softly in the breeze and the first stars began to blink overhead. His phone buzzed with a message from Mr. Stevens. The board president, Eli. The board would like to invite you to a formal recognition event next month. We want to thank you for your leadership and the positive changes you've helped bring to our neighborhood. Hope you can join us. Eli smiled. He hadn't expected anything like this when the letter first arrived on his door. What had seemed like a conflict had become an opportunity for growth for himself and for the entire neighborhood. The evening of the event arrived and the clubhouse was filled with neighbors, old and new. Sharing stories and laughter, Mr. Stevens took the microphone and spoke warmly about Eli's role. Eli's dedication has reminded us that our neighborhood is more than rules or property lines. It's a community built on respect, dialogue, and shared care. We're grateful for his vision and commitment. Eli accepted a simple plaque but looked around the room at the faces friends, neighbors, fellow advocates. The real reward was a neighborhood transformed by conversations and collaboration. A place where voices were heard and differences bridged. Later, outside under the stars, Eli spoke with Linda and Greg, who thanked him again for helping turn a difficult situation into something positive as they talked. Eli realized that his cabin, once threatened by an abrupt order, was now a symbol of connection. He thought about the journey, the letter, the meetings, the neighbors' voices, the unexpected challenges, and the solutions they'd crafted together. Eli understood that change often begins with a single spark. Sometimes inconvenient or surprising, but that spark can ignite something much greater. With a quiet sense of satisfaction, he looked out toward the mountains. Feeling at peace, the neighborhood's future was bright, and so was his place in it.